Monarch Divine Aliastros watched the town of parasites through the lens of a satellite. His clawed fingers encased in a tungsten war gauntlet clacked against the arm of his throne. His advisor stood calmly at his side, observing the holoscreen with disdain. Your Majesty, shall we use the satellite to make an example of these parasites? The monarch stared pensively at the screen, reaching up and scratching his graying throat scales as he mulled over his advisor's words. The satellite had 13 gravity-driven kinetic projectiles on board. Just one would be enough to level the town if he dropped it in the middle. But who would spread the word if there was no one left? Smiling softly, Monarch Divine adjusted the satellite to target the ground 1.5 kilometers away from the parasite's colony. He'd be relying on the shockwave to do most of the damage, but it would still be plenty lethal. A wonderful idea, Advisor Knox. Let us see how rebellious they feel afterwards. Monarch Divine pressed a button on his throne's armrest and watched the satellite's video feed shudder before he deactivated the holoscreen. Glancing to his advisor, he cracked a malicious grin, shaking his head with pity. Ah, these dirty little apes are so pathetic. I almost feels bad for them. But alas, they bring this on themselves, don't they? Advisor Knox grinned softly and bowed deeply. Correct as always, Your Majesty. Drake wiped the sweat from his brow, accepting a gourd filled with water from Gale, the little Clauville girl that was his neighbor. Uncapping it, he chugged back a healthy portion of the water, his dry throat aching with relief as he swallowed the cool essence of life. He smiled at Gale as he capped the gourd and handed it back to her. Drake settled his hands back on the plow. The Grox hooked up to it, grumbling in response as it got ready to pull. Drake watched as Gale began to run back towards the gate, heart swelling with happiness. For now, they were free. It had been a week since he'd strung the high priest from the tree at the town center, and life had returned to normal, albeit without slave masters cracking their whips at them. Drake was just about to nudge the Grox into action when he felt the ground start to rumble. Happiness turned to stone-cold dread as Drake let go of the plow, running after Gale as the rumbling grew more violent. He felt like he was moving through molasses as he shouted helplessly, reaching her. Gale! Wait! The little girl turned, face scrunched with confusion. The green-skinned little girl suddenly smiled, head crests flaring in her species' version of laughter. She lifted a hand, waving nonchalantly. Drake watched, as if in slow motion, as an invisible wave of destruction shattered the town's thin defensive wall and tore up the ground as it raced towards him. Then it all went black. Death stepped onto the rubble of the dead town. He cast his gaze up and down the street as he walked, bloodless heart heavy. Bodies were strewn about the rubble, human and Clauville alike. Death paused, looking down at a pair of bodies, a human woman clutching a Clauville child to her chest in a futile attempt to shield them from the shockwave. Death continued walking after a moment, drawn to the glowing congregation of souls at the town's edge, but not before a tattered white sheet was laid over the woman and child. As he got closer, he realized the souls of the recently departed were guarding something. No. Someone. Death stopped a few feet away from the congregation, gazing at the glowing image of an old man with a braided beard. The old man did not offer a word to the Grim Reaper as he stood at parade rest. Death just gazed through them, looking at the crumpled form at the center. The boy's shirt and pants were little more than bloody rags. Cuts and bruises covered his body, one arm bending the wrong way at the elbow, half buried in the rubble. Drake was a pitiful sight, but he still drew breath. Death nodded in understanding, bones creaking as he sighed. Forgive me for being rude, but it is time for us to go. Your leader will live. Death watched, waiting for them to step forward, but they didn't, which didn't surprise him much. He could feel it in the air. Their will to continue on filled the air, so thick one could feel it in their bones. The Reaper sighed tiredly and finally asked his question. There is something you want, something you think only I can provide. What, pray tell, is that? Much to Death's surprise, it wasn't the old man who spoke, but a little Clauville girl who weaved between the legs of the other souls to reach him. Bravely she stepped forward, glaring at the scythe-wielding skeleton before her.
He fought them when we were all too afraid to.
He offered his life instead of my father's for the arena. He gave us the gift of freedom to do as we pleased without fear of the whip. Mr. Death, please, is there any way we can return the favor before we move on?" Death panned his gaze over the resolute, determined faces of the townsfolk. Both young and old stood firmly at his champion's side. He felt his cold heart beat and sighed, letting the mask of bones fall away as he set his hand on the little girl's shoulder, a weary smile coming to the teen-aged face of Death. "I often forget what it means to be alive, to be human, if you'll forgive the euphemism. And yes, my child, there is a way you all may show your gratitude." Death raised his palm towards Drake's fallen form, and they all watched as it began to glow with a golden luster. Death spoke, voice echoing with power. "If you wish to lend him your strength, step forward and lend me your hand." Gale smiled up at the Reaper and touched his hand, fading away as she spoke. "Thank you." One by one, each of the townsfolk stepped forward to place their hand against Death's. One by one, they faded away with ghostly words of gratitude. By the end of it all, Death was left alone with Drake, palm glowing as he knelt and pressed it to the boy's chest. "May their strength be yours. May their fighting spirit your own." Drake glowed a bright golden hue as the Reaper's voice boomed with the overflowing power. "And fight, my child, for what you and yours have been so cruelly denied."